The subject for today is a question. Is there a God? Or even, is there a God of good and a God of evil? Does God exist? We know there are things beyond human comprehension, things that are too large and things that are too small for the human mind to grasp or even experience. Someday the human will achieve those things, those goals, but there will always be things out of reach. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what God is. God is something that's totally beyond human comprehension and always will be. We need to change our thinking about these things and realize that the sole purpose of life is to expand, to grow more complex, and to try all possibilities, both good and bad possibilities. It's to experience and grow. To ponder imponderables like how many angels can sit on the end of a pin, or who created this and who created him or her, or after that. There is a waste of time and a waste of energy. Those questions are called infinite regression questions because they can go on and on forever. To be caught up in those things is to have our power taken away from us. It's much better to just leave them, to realize that they exist, let them be. There's no, even if we knew the answer to some of those things, it wouldn't solve any problems. But on the other hand, there are things that we can experience. There are things that we can know. And one of the things that we do know is that the building block of our physical world and our physical universe is the photon, electricity, and magnetic field energies. We can even simplify these down into personal, or rather impersonal, vibratory forces of scalar expansion and contraction. It's all vibration. Everything is vibration. You've heard it before. All that exists is just vibratory energy. But that vibratory energy is expansive and contractive. It expands outward and then it expands inward. That movement, when it radiates outward in all directions, can be called masculine, while the embracing, formative, inward movement and forces can be called feminine in nature. So everything that exists can be understood as the equal balance of masculine, radiant, and feminine, embracing. These outward and inward movements, forces, are always balanced. A movement in an outward direction is always balanced by a movement in an inward direction. In science, we say for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, and that's what we're talking about here. We're not talking about a God of good and a God of evil equally existing. What we're talking about is a balance, an equal balance of impersonal forces. Even the human race has two guiding group souls, if you will, that collectively represent the male experience and the female experience. It is fitting to call these collective gestalt energies guiding forces. We can call them God and Goddess, with the understanding that it is a symbolic thing that represents the psychic collective of the human race and its opposite views. So that's where the mystery schools came from, with their understanding of a God and Goddess, eternally opposed, two creators and two rulers, without beginning and without end. The God, the male, created the spirits and spirit worlds, the invisible world, the astral worlds, the world of perfection that knows no suffering and pain. But it's also a very sterile world, and it doesn't go anywhere by itself. So there's pros and cons to that. The goddess created the visible, the physical, and the perishable, all of life, physical life. She created the flesh and its passions, the earth with its struggles, torments, doubts, and tears, as well as its joys and its depth. We live in both worlds. We live in the spiritual world and we live in the physical world. We contain both natures inside of us, and they are not in conflict. They're masculine and feminine. And they are meant to exist in eternal love toward each other, to embrace each other in love, not eternal conflict. But in our patriarchal world, the masculine has the masculine nature, and the masculine forces, the expansive forces, have been called God. While the feminine forces and nature have been demonized and called Satan. To those caught up in the lies of the patriarchal thinking, the return and rise of the divine feminine means the triumph of Satan. That's why they're so afraid. Nothing can be further from the truth. But it's duality. This whole thing is about duality, and unity is duality in terms of vibration, vibratory energy, in terms of the balance of the male and the female. To those who can only see one side, it has to be either light or black. And that's not what we are. That's not what life is. We are in between, and we're both. We're shades of gray. And we can't experience the extremes. To go too far in one direction makes us unbalanced, and it also causes our divine counterparts to go wacko in the opposite direction just to balance our own. So we got to think about this thing, and we got to think about duality in a totally different way than we have before. Duality is our friend. because it is a unified duality, not a conflict duality. It is an embrace of love. It is an embrace of the masculine and the feminine in all things. And it's time to get rid of the idea of good versus evil. Those things in good versus evil are subjective anyway. For the person that believes in the polar opposites of good and evil, the way that they do it is they say, I can be a good friend, but I can also be a bad enemy. And that's how they try to balance it. But they don't understand that sometimes we hurt the ones we love, even when we don't want to. And sometimes the ones we love hurt us. And sometimes we help our enemies. That it's right to help our enemies, even when sometimes our enemies can extend a hand of friendship to us. So it's too simplistic. This whole concept of duality is too simplistic to take one side. We integrate our higher self into our soul, into our sense of self, our ego, and we integrate our shadow self into the same. We do this by living from the heart. And the Rosicrucians have always believed in listening to the still small voice of conscience that speaks in our hearts, the Christ Spirit that speaks in our hearts, if we will only listen. We already know, there's a part of us that already knows what we need, if we will only listen. We do have a master that lives inside our hearts. It's an internal master, and it's trying to talk to us if we would only listen, instead of constantly listening to external authorities. What you're going to see is I'm going to kind of pound on external authorities versus internal authorities, and I'm going to try to pound on the balance of male and female, because these are the things that this new eon, this new age is about. Thank you. Check my website, and I appreciate your help.